On this episode of Documento, I have Anya and Leonard to speak about classical studies. She is the co-founder of Classical Wisdom, and I thought she'd be the perfect person to speak about this topic. Anya, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's great to speak to you.
So the pleasure's all mine. I'm very excited about this topic. It's something that's very dear to my heart, and I really want the viewers to understand what classics is all about. So the first question for you really is what is classical studies?
Well, classical studies, specifically speaking, refers to anything to do with the Greco-Roman world. And that's a very broad category when you get down to it. It's language, philosophy, history, art, literature, archaeology. But if you want to be more specific, it's the time period between the mid-second millennium, BC, 6th century AD. And the sort of specifics of the word, even classics, comes from the Latin classicus, belonging to the highest class of citizens. But the classics, it's a time period of history that you're studying, but it's a really important time period. I mean, there's lots of very important time periods, but this one happens to be highly influential, and both specifically and much further on. And so as a result, it's a very interesting time period, really, to investigate.
Now, it's a fascinating time period, and there's a lot of value in it, I think. For viewers that don't know, I studied classics myself for many years, and I constantly drew so much value out of it practically every day in my life. And I spent a lot of time trying to explain to people, that value. I want to ask you as the next question, what are some of the practical benefits? What's the value of studying classics and taking from the past and applying it today?
Well, every single individual have innumerable reasons why they find it practical or interesting. I'm going to just address three specifically that at least apply to me that I find, but will probably be applicable to many more. The first is maybe a more academic reason. Until, right up to the 19th century, you could not be considered an educated person unless you'd studied the classics, which means that while the classics period was directly influential to, the medieval time period, the Renaissance, obviously neoclassicism, all this, even more modern philosophers, artists, writers drew on the classics because they all had to study it. So if you want to study William Shakespeare, you should know some of the classics. If you want to study languages, modern European languages, you should study some Latin. If you want to understand the history of empires and the world, you should study the classics. And if you want to understand psychology, Nietzsche goes straight into the archetypes of Apollo and Dionysus. Every major discipline draws on it at some point or another. And if you really want to enjoy walking through the Louvre and the Prado and seeing great art, how much more do you enjoy it if you have studied the myths that they're depicting, if you studied the people that they're describing through all the major disciplines. I personally loved Euclid for studying geometry. You really, it just kind of is a fundamental cornerstone of all subsequent sort of Western knowledge. But the second reason I think is actually personal, individual, is that what the ancients were trying to discover were human problems. They're questions that we've been asking for thousands of years, and they're still important questions to ask. Like, what is it to be a good person? What is good? What is evil? What is happiness? What makes us happy? These are things that people every day are trying to figure out. And they're getting lost in things like social media or these or that, but the reality is we have to sit down and ask these questions. And the ancients, I don't necessarily believe that a lot of the solutions are full, entirety philosophies that we should live by, but they offer a lot of important questions and roadmaps to how to live even today. And you can see this in a resurgence of Stoicism, for instance, that the kind of principles of realizing what we have in our control and what's out of our control, and accepting the things that are out of our control and accepting ways to change what's in our control. And you see this in like AA meetings today.
Yeah.
I personally am a bit more of an Epicurean,
All right.
but a lot of these philosophies, you know, answer important questions. And the third reason I think it's super practical is perspective. It's amazing how humbling, how grounding it is when you're facing the day-to-day stresses, when you think about the connection we have to people over thousands of years, and them going through similar things, whether it's your parent-child relationships or love and love lost and war and heroes and homes and, you know, these major themes. We haven't changed that much in thousands of years. And the second part of that sort of perspective is that, you know, humans, we're very pattern-seeking species. And we can learn so much by looking at the thousands of years of patterns that we have, the ebbs and flows of history. If you want to understand where we are in politics, in regards to empires that grow and build and fall, in financial policies and inflation, I mean, these things that affect our day-to-day life, you can get such a better understanding about where we are and what's to come, in a way, by looking at the historical examples. You know, history might not repeat itself, but it does certainly rhyme. And because as humans, we haven't really changed that much, you can really predict in some ways what's going to happen next. Sometimes tragically, you know, but it's good to know, it's good to be aware of. And, you know, it was Plato that first said all democracy ends in tyranny. So I don't know where we are in that pattern at this particular moment, but it's the more you know, the more you can make your own personal decisions, the more financial, political, philosophical, all of those, you really become so much more knowledgeable about the world around you right now by knowing what the world has been.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there were so many points that you just discussed that we could branch off on. Like, this would be a very long interview.
So many things, sorry, all at once.
Yeah, it's a tough question. There's so much to say. You might need a whole book to write it out. But one thing that really strikes me about classics and what got me immersed in the whole study is the fact that it makes you a well-rounded person. You're exposed, like you said, to so many different disciplines, and it forces you to kind of think outside the box in unique ways. So you have, today we're exposed to so much information, and if we have a fundamental understanding based on our readings of the past, we can contribute in very unique ways. We can connect seemingly disparate pieces of information. And I think that's very promising for the future.
Well, I think just in general, if you come from sort of mixed disciplines, you're able to approach problems, in different ways. And I think that the modern term of intelligence is being able to problem solve. And if you use the tools of different understandings and perspectives, you're going to be able to problem solve in a way that maybe your average person doesn't even think of.
Absolutely. And it's a long-term investment, I think. We're very focused on short-term investments and short-term gains, but, reading these things take time to consume, to understand. And then with time, you build this knowledge base that's extremely valuable and marketable in many job positions. I think it's just, we don't see the dollar sign immediately attached to classics, and that might be a force of conflict, and it doesn't get the attention that it deserves, So that's my personal take, but all the points you just said are fascinating, and I think everybody should really deep dive into those. The third question I have for you is a little kind of a shift. I wanted to ask you, what are 3 of your favorite individuals from this time period, and why?
Well, that's kind of like picking your own children. It's a tricky one. And I have a few that I like for very different reasons. So I might put my first one as Sappho.
Okay.
There's very little known about her, and there's very little remaining of her. We've only sort of so for anyone who wants a recap, she's quite an ancient Greek poet who wrote in the Ionian dialect, and is, where the term lesbian comes from actually is from her birth, the island of Lesbos. And she, wrote about love for men and women. I mean, there's a lot of, she also wrote publicly. There's a whole minefield of things you can discuss specifically with her. But that all aside, you even read her fragments and they're just so beautiful. I mean, they really do tap into the sort of eternal beauty, timelessness that you want to find in these ancient poets and artists. And I find that very rewarding. And only in the last few years, a lot of her full complete poems have been, or not complete, but more complete poems of hers have been found. And that's obviously...
Oh, wow.
It's very exciting to see that because of modern day archaeological, discoveries and pirates and that we're discovering more, that it's not just something that's just been found and sitting on a bookshelf. It's a continuous discovery. And I think that's really exciting, that the possibility of what we're going to find more of her work and other great poets. My second, I would say, would be Epicurus, because I was saying I feel like I'm a bit of an Epicurean. And right. I don't mean that just because I'm a foodie, because I am.
Okay.
But
you're not alone.
Also, the modern interpretation of Epicurean is actually a lot more like hedonism, which is unfair, because Epicurus was a lot more about moderation. You enjoy food in so much that you can enjoy it. The second you eat too much and you don't feel good, it's no good anymore. Right. Similarly with alcohol, like, enjoy your wine, but if you're getting a really bad hangover, you're not really enjoying it. So
yeah.
Moderation was actually his key. And also personally, I think like many people, when you're delving into your psyche and psychology and philosophy, the concept of death at the end can be frightening. Epicurus really delves into that, of letting go to the fears of death and just enjoying our current lives. And I find that very helpful for me personally. And my third one I'm going to pick is, at first, you're not going to think she belongs to the Greco-Roman world.
Okay.
Is Cleopatra.
Oh, nice.
Yes, well, so for those who don't know, Cleopatra was actually a Macedonian Greek and was probably related to Alexander the Great. And the Ptolemies was a branch off during the breakup of the Greek Empire that went down to rule the Egyptians. And she was actually the first of the Ptolemies to learn ancient Egyptian and speak in the local language. And she actually spoke 9 languages and traveled extensively throughout the ancient world, saw many of the ancient wonders of the world, and was obviously a very brilliant woman, but also, in her time period as a ruler, was a very effective ruler. She was one of the only Ptolemies to not have any riots during her time period.
Oh, wow.
And of course, she's sort of more famous maybe for her entangling with the Roman Empire via Mark Antony and Julius Caesar,
right.
To put it politely.
Yeah.
But she was a very smart woman, and she had to figure out ways to succeed in literally a man's world, and was quite literally a brilliant person. And I think she contributed greatly to the ancient Greco-Roman world overall.
3 excellent choices.
Thank you.
We figured we can... What's that?
I could go on easily.
Oh, yeah, totally. This could be a very long interview. But I figured we could close this interview with an introduction of yourself, and feel free to say anything else, any closing remarks.
Well, okay, as you generally said, my name is Anya Leonard. I'm the co-founder of Classical Wisdom. We've been running for a few years now, and our motto basically is to bring ancient wisdom to modern minds, and our goal is to promote and preserve the classics and just, really present the classical world in an interesting and entertaining way to reach everybody, so that to remind everyone, it doesn't belong in dusty books, that philosophy and history and art and literature can be as fun and entertaining. I mean, they have survived thousands of years for a reason, because they're really good and interesting. And I genuinely believe people's lives are added to by this study, basically.
Agreed. Anya, thank you so much for this. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
You too.